China and many other countries have been buying huge amounts of gold instead of buying treasuries and other dollar-denominated assets. They may very well start buying more Bitcoin.
On the Spot with Michelle Makori is brought to you by Swan Bitcoin.
Hello, I'm Michelle Makori. Welcome back. We are continuing our conversation with Fred Thiel, Chairman and CEO of Marathon Digital Holdings, one of the world's largest Bitcoin miners. And it's been exactly a year since the big FTX collapse, which saw Bitcoin prices tumbling to $16,000. Bitcoin price has more than doubled since then, and that rally has largely been fueled by speculation that the SEC approving a spot Bitcoin ETF is a matter of when, not if, and that when is looking increasingly sooner rather than later. But BlackRock and other institutions getting into the Bitcoin space is raising some red flags. And one point of concern, Fred, is that BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, will have centralized custody of a big chunk of Bitcoin, because with a spot Bitcoin ETF, you need custody of the underlying asset for any spot ETF. Now, BlackRock has also taken a stake in several miners. BlackRock has invested in 4 of the 5 largest Bitcoin miners by market cap, and this now makes the BlackRock Fund's advisors a major member of the Bitcoin Mining Council, which is a lobbying group for the Bitcoin mining industry. And they may purchase even more miners. And one of the concerns is that between the miners and a spot Bitcoin ETF, that BlackRock may be consolidating too much power across the Bitcoin ecosystem, and that this all takes away from the decentralized money mission of Bitcoin. It brings it back into the traditional financial system that, in a way, Bitcoin was supposed to be an alternative to. So do you see this institutional interest, and particularly from BlackRock, potentially jeopardizing Bitcoin's decentralized ethos and problematic for the broader Bitcoin mission?
No. Think about it this way. There are likely somewhere between 4 and 5 million Bitcoin in liquid circulation today. The rest of it is held off chain, or not off chain, but it's in cold storage, hasn't moved in multiple years. And arguably 4 or 5 million Bitcoin could be lost forever. Because back in the early days, people didn't care and they'd forgotten their keys or lost their access to their wallets. So I think it would be very hard for BlackRock to accumulate a position of owning 20% of Bitcoin that are out there. So it would drive Bitcoin prices to such heights that the question would be what the benefit for them in having that would be. And by the way, BlackRock has, through their other funds, accumulated quite a lot of Bitcoin, actually. They've been buying actively since last year. And that potentially will enable them. I don't know how the rules work, but they may be able to transfer from the other funds into the ETF when that's approved, as a way to save from having to go and buy in the open market. We don't know. As regards investing in miners, BlackRock, as many other investment funds, have index funds where they have to buy, for example, a Russell 2000 stocks, and they will invest in these stocks, and they will hold up to 10%, for example. And if you look at who are the holders, the large holders institutionally of the larger miners, they tend to be these index funds, because we're part of the Russell 2000 index, as are a number of our peers. And so they have to buy our stock, and they buy up to a certain position. For them to accumulate a position of 40 or 50%, would drive our stock up through the roof. And I would be very happy if they took a big position in our stock. I don't think there would be any benefit in them controlling us, because what could they do? If you think about it, okay, we're a miner, the largest publicly traded miner in the world by production capacity, and we control 4% of all the Bitcoin made in the last quarter. That wouldn't give them a whole lot of control of anything if they owned us 100%. So while I love conspiracies, I think it's very entertaining to listen to. I'm a bigger believer in the fact that the US government is releasing UFO data on purpose to hide something else than I am that BlackRock has aspirations of locking up a corner of the Bitcoin market by owning the miners and controlling Bitcoin.
All right. Well, there is another point to consider here, and that is that Bitcoin loses its medium of exchange role, and that's a concern vocalized by billionaire Arthur Hayes. He's an entrepreneur and Wharton School graduate. He co-founded BitMEX, one of the largest crypto exchanges globally. Just so for those that aren't familiar with Arthur Hayes, and he recently said that if they were to get into this, institutional players, he's calling them agents of the state, that they often operate like that, and they could act according to government directives, potentially manipulating Bitcoin to keep citizens within the fiat currency system for easier taxation through inflation. One of the exact quotes on a podcast that he was on: if the BlackRock ETF gets too big, it could actually kill Bitcoin because it's just a bunch of immovable Bitcoin that's just sitting there. You can't actually use the Bitcoin. It's a financial asset. It's not the actual Bitcoin itself. So concerned that it'll be relegated to a mere financial asset, not a currency actively in use, locked away in ETFs, owned indirectly by investors and controlled by asset managers. That was one of his concerns there. And again, echoing this idea that these big institutions are what he calls essentially arms of traditional finance ecosystem and agents of government to a degree, and saying that the fundamentals of what Bitcoin is could be altered. Do you share that sentiment? Do you think that has any merit?
So there are, and all due respect to Arthur Hayes, he's been a long-term Bitcoiner from the early days, big supporter, and you know, an avid believer and supporter of Bitcoin. Bitcoin, arguably today, is just a financial instrument. It's a store of value. The amount of Bitcoin used for transacting is fairly low. In El Salvador, other places like that, you're seeing it used. Venezuela, countries with ultra high inflation where there isn't really an alternative. And when you look closely in those countries, even people are using Tether and stable coins because there's so much volatility in Bitcoin. You put your savings in Bitcoin, you transfer from Bitcoin to a stable coin to transact. And go back to the earlier comment you and I just had where I said about buying a bus ticket with Bitcoin. You said you wouldn't recommend anybody buy a bus ticket with Bitcoin. People don't want to use Bitcoin to transact because you have to pay taxes every time you buy something with Bitcoin because you're selling your Bitcoin. And so it's not really used as a currency. And I believe that the regulators have the view on Bitcoin that they do because they don't view it as a risk to the fiat currency of the US. They view it as an asset, a store of value. And I think that while longer term, countries may choose to hold their assets, their reserve assets in Bitcoin as one of many instruments, China and many other countries have been buying huge amounts of gold instead of buying treasuries and other dollar-denominated assets. They may very well start buying more Bitcoin, which means more governments will want to go into the business of mining Bitcoin, because as long as there are people outside of the US mining Bitcoin and operating pools, nothing the US government or any entity in the US can do can impact Bitcoin. It will continue to operate and it will continue to have value for the people in the ecosystem. And so I'm a big believer that Bitcoin's decentralization is its single biggest asset. And that is why we're very focused as a company on diversifying our operations globally. We want to have 50% of our operations outside of the US and North America because we believe that Bitcoin's future is predominantly outside of the US. More Bitcoin is traded outside the US than in the US today. And we see more and more interest from sovereigns around the world to hold Bitcoin and hold reserve assets in Bitcoin and use Bitcoin mining as a way to stabilize grids and for energy security and other use cases. And which is why we're so bullish on the international aspect of Bitcoin. So I personally don't have a fear that Bitcoin will be manipulated by BlackRock or any of the large financial institutions and banks, other than the same way they manipulate the gold market or any of these other markets. And look at how gold has operated for thousands of years.
Well, look, a lot of people would argue that the gold price has been suppressed because of the fact that there's more paper gold than real gold out there. And I mean, we know that there's been spoofing of silver prices. JP Morgan has been accused of that, as well as other funds and other big institutional players. But I want to touch on this point where you said you see sovereign interest. What do you mean by that? I mean, when you say sovereigns as looking at it as a reserve asset, let's expand on that idea.
So again, think of, you're a commodity producing country. You are generating revenues coming in foreign currency into your country. You need to hold those profits somewhere. For many years, the US dollar has been the primary reserve currency and the home, because of its stability, safety, rule of law, et cetera, for a lot of these assets. They have invested in treasuries, they have invested in US equities, real estate in the US. Look at all the money that came from China into the US market, all the money that comes from the Middle East into the US markets. If they want to have more diversification, or if the US currency were to start losing its attractiveness because its value started to drop in relation to other currencies because of what the federal government does relative to spending and deficits, then you need to find alternatives. And where else would you put your money? You can only hold so much gold before it becomes too concentrated. You have too much of it in your portfolio. You need to look for alternative assets. And Bitcoin, on a risk-adjusted basis, has been proven to be a very good asset. And best of all, it is an asset that cannot be weaponized. The US government cannot weaponize Bitcoin. It can weaponize dollars. It can weaponize gold potentially if it wanted to. A lot of the world's gold reserves are actually held in the US. Look at what the US did to Russia's gold reserves. So I think there are a lot of reasons why sovereigns are and should be looking at Bitcoin as a reserve asset. You have the country of Bhutan, for example, that's mining Bitcoin now, and they've just decided to more than double the capacity of mining in their country. You have other sovereigns around the world looking at this as a way to not just hold Bitcoin, but if you're mining Bitcoin and you operate your own pool, then all of a sudden you now have independence from the rest of the market. As long as somebody is mining Bitcoin, somewhere in the world, Bitcoin transactions can happen. And being independent of control of large nations is very important to certain commodity producing sovereigns.
No, we've certainly seen that de-dollarization trend, as you mentioned, with the what many have called the weaponization of the US dollar following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the sanctions imposed against Russia, taking Russia off the SWIFT system. That has caused many countries to go, maybe we shouldn't be holding dollars. We know that China has dramatically reduced its holdings of dollars and US treasuries. And we know, as you just pointed out, that central banks around the world have been buying gold at record levels, both last year and this year. So you see Bitcoin then potentially benefiting from the broader de-dollarization trend. Do you see countries officially saying we're buying Bitcoin as a reserve at some point? And I guess which one? I mean, other than El Salvador, we know El Salvador's made a move there. But where do you see this happening? At what rate? Over what timeline?
So we are seeing interest in the technology we produce regarding our pool software. You have to, if you're mining Bitcoin, you want to operate a pool if you have enough substance in your mining, because that gives you ultimate control over transactions. So we are seeing inbound interest from the outside of the US. I'm not going to necessarily disclose where. From various people who are very interested in starting to do this. We see more and more countries very interested in leveraging their stranded energy for Bitcoin mining, not just for energy security, but also for the opportunity to earn and hold Bitcoin. So I think you're going to start seeing this become more common. The other thing is, as I said earlier, on a risk-adjusted basis, Bitcoin is a good asset to hold. Listen, if major corporations are going to start putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet, if sovereign wealth funds are going to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet, and they have been, then it makes all the sense in the world to own more of that ecosystem and that infrastructure. And there are many countries today who have very inexpensive energy where they can go in the business of mining Bitcoin and generating quite attractive returns for that energy, which otherwise would be wasted. And in doing so, can start building reserves and additionally buy in the market as they deem fit. But I don't see a sovereign going out and announcing, hey, we're buying Bitcoin because the price of Bitcoin will just go up. So it would be a little bit counterintuitive.
Well, maybe not at this point. Maybe after they have the infrastructure and have accumulated it, on the sly or in a discreet manner. Maybe at that point it becomes public.
Absolutely.
I know you don't want to reveal which countries, but we do have to point out that Marathon has interests in the United Arab Emirates, and you guys have been expanding globally as well. So why don't you elaborate on Marathon's international expansion, and maybe you can highlight which countries you're seeing interest from in that context?
Sure. So obviously the Gulf region is very attractive because they're energy producing. They're commodity producers that produce energy and have a lot of excess energy. The motivation in the UAE was for grid stability and the fact that in the summertime, they consume, from an energy production perspective, they need 4 gigawatt hours of energy being produced, 4 gigawatts per hour being produced. And in the wintertime, only 1, yet they need to run this energy infrastructure all of the time because they also use it for water desalination purposes. And so a lot of energy was being wasted. So by leveraging that inexpensive energy for Bitcoin mining, you get 2 benefits. One is you're able to sell the energy as opposed to giving it away. And more importantly, it helps stabilize your grid, meaning that when you get demand shifts in the grid, you can just tell the Bitcoin miners, hey, shut down. And then all of a sudden you get increased capacity without having to go tell a gas-fired plant or a fossil fuel plant to turn up their percentage of production. And in UAE, they recently brought online a nuclear reactor, which is sustainable green energy. So they had excess energy. Paraguay, for example, we're mining there behind the Itaipu Dam, which is one of the largest hydroelectric dams in the world. And Paraguay has a problem where they generate 32 terawatt hours of energy in excess of what they need. So they have no place to sell it other than potentially Brazil and their neighbors, and they have to sell it at a loss. And so by bringing in Bitcoin miners, they're able to now monetize that energy that otherwise would be wasted, and that generates taxes for them and other incomes, jobs, et cetera. Africa, we're seeing a lot of interest in countries like Kenya, where they've added solar energy in addition to their existing hydroelectric infrastructure, and they now have grid stability issues. So they want Bitcoin miners to come in and help stabilize the grid. You're seeing that in other countries around the world. Bhutan started with 200 megawatts of Bitcoin mining and has recently announced that I think that they're going to grow to 500 megawatts. This is a very small country with a lot of hydroelectricity. They can all of a sudden now be a commodity producer. Because the problem with electricity is you can't bundle it up in a barrel, load it on a ship, and send it somewhere. Electricity can only travel maximally 1,000 kilometers before the losses due to transmission becomes so high that it's not worth it. But you can convert electricity into Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is transportable anywhere in the world in an instant and holds its value very nicely. So that's why you're starting to see energy producers look into Bitcoin and produce that.
So, Fred, it sounds to me as though the adoption path for Bitcoin is moving now from retail to institutions. And from what you're saying, sovereigns would be the next step after institutional investors.
Absolutely. I think you're seeing a large number of partnerships with energy companies. You have energy companies were involved with Bitcoin mining from an interest perspective initially around methane gas flaring, where you have oil fields where you have to flare the gas. You're burning this methane gas because if you vent it in the air, it's very damaging. They now want to capture that methane, use it for generating energy to drive Bitcoin mines and monetize that methane. You're also seeing just energy producers, hydroelectric producers, utilities, et cetera, want to better monetize their energy. So energy companies and Bitcoin miners are starting to partner. We're mining Bitcoin with landfill gas off of trash heaps, capturing that methane, turning it into Bitcoin, for example. And you're going to see agricultural bio-waste. You're going to see all sorts of waste being turned into Bitcoin, as opposed to using load off the grid. And so now more and more countries and industries are going to get involved in this. And I think Bitcoin is going to be one of these commodities, if you would, that is produced through the virtuous cycle of converting waste energy into heat and using that heat for things. And Bitcoin will be a byproduct of that and an exhaust that will generate profits for people all over the world. So
literally turning trash into treasure, Fred.
Absolutely.
As we wrap up here, you mentioned that there's an interesting connection between Marathon and shrimp farming. So why don't we close off with you telling us about that?
Yeah. So as I just said, you take stranded energy, turn it into heat. What can you do with that heat? Well, you can heat buildings, you can heat greenhouses, which is something we're starting to do. And we recently decided to do a test regarding shrimp farming because you can use this heat offtake to facilitate the farming of shrimp. Why shrimp? Well, shrimp actually creates a very low-cost protein that can be done anywhere that you can run Bitcoin miners now. You don't have to only do it in places where you have low-cost energy, where you're buying electricity to heat this process and facilitate this process. So we've recently gotten a permit in the state of Washington to start shrimp farming. We're not doing it in the ocean. We're not doing it in ponds. We're doing it in industrial facilities as an experiment to see. And it gets very interesting. If you can take wasted energy and then you can convert that energy into heat and sell that heat for something like shrimp farming or so aquaculture or agriculture with greenhouses or heating buildings, Bitcoin mining then costs you nothing to do. It's a function of the heat generation. And if you're getting paid for generating the heat in excess of what it costs you to mine, then essentially you can mine Bitcoin at zero cost.
Right, and with other edible benefits. We were just in New Orleans. Team Kitco was there for a conference. Lots of shrimp on the menu. Fred, what's your favorite shrimp type of dish?
Oh, gosh. I love shrimp on the grill with a little bit of garlic, some fresh lemon juice, and a little bit of basil on it.
Can't argue with that. Fred, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and your insights from Marathon to Bitcoin to shrimp. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for watching. A special thank you to our sponsor, Swan Bitcoin. We do want to tell our viewers that there is a Swan IRA product that actually allows you to invest in Bitcoin with your IRA. And you can set it up to buy Bitcoin essentially on autopilot and take advantage of dollar cost averaging. The setup is free. And there is a link in the description of this video for Kitco viewers that are interested in looking at that. Until next time, from me, Michelle Makori, and the rest of the Kitco team, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.
On the Spot with Michelle Makori is brought to you by Swan Bitcoin. Swan Bitcoin IRA. Your legacy, your way. Real Bitcoin, not proxies. Traditional and Roth IRAs. Fast, easy setup. Start now at swan.com/retire.